the first thing any builder looks for is flat, solid ground. It's the whole foundation of architecture, literally. So what do you make of the people who looked at a sheer cliff, a rushing river, the top of a needle of rock, the inside of a stone cone, and said, "There, I'll build there. I'm an architect"? These are buildings that have no business existing where they do, and the reason they're still standing is never an accident. Each one solved an impossible sight with a single, specific trick, and each one was put there for a reason worth the risk. Cliffs, rivers, rooftops. 8 buildings that pick the one place you're not supposed to build, and the one trick that keeps each of them up. Before we climb anything, here's the lens I use. Every building does one job before it does anything else. It takes its own weight and hands it, safely, to the earth. On flat ground that's easy, gravity does it for you. On a cliff, in a river, on a roof, that one quiet job becomes the entire problem. So when I look at a building somewhere it shouldn't be, I'm not asking, is this magic? I'm asking one thing. Where does the weight actually go? Find that single path, the beam, the rock, the overhang, and the impossible building turns ordinary. Watch how each of these 8 answers that one question differently. Start in China, on the face of a sacred mountain. The Hanging Temple has clung to a sheer cliff for over 1,500 years, its halls perched roughly 75 meters above the valley floor. From below, it looks like the whole thing is resting on a forest of impossibly thin wooden stilts, toothpicks holding up a building. And every visitor's first instinct is the same. Those can't be enough. They're right. Here's the trick. Those stilts are mostly for show. Some of them don't even carry load. The real work is done by around 27 stout wooden beams, driven deep and horizontally into holes carved straight into the rock. The cliff itself is the foundation. The temple doesn't stand on the mountain. It hangs off it, like a heavy shelf bolted into a wall, with the beams in compression and the rock taking the load. And the builders read the cliff like a roof. A natural overhang far above leans out over the halls, throwing rain and falling rock clear of the timber. That's why 1,500-year-old wood is still up there at all. So why build somewhere this insane? 2 reasons, and both are practical. Devotion, it sits where 3 religions met, close to the heavens. And protection, high enough to escape the floods of the valley, hard enough to reach that no casual army would bother. The impossible perch was the safety. Now to Greece, and an even bolder idea. Don't cling to the cliff, build on top of it. At Meteora, giant pillars of stone rise hundreds of feet straight out of the plain, sheer on every side, and on the very summits of them sit monasteries that are centuries old. Look at one, and your brain just refuses it. There's no slope, no path, no way up. That was the entire point. Originally, there were no stairs at all. To reach the top, monks were hauled up the bare rock faces in nets and baskets on long ropes, swinging over the drop. And here's the part that stops me as a builder. Everything else went up the same way. Every stone block, every roof beam, every barrel of water and sack of food, lifted by rope, by hand, hundreds of feet, for years. The building site was the hardest part of the building. So why suffer it? Defense. Up there, the monasteries were almost impossible to attack, a fortress made of nothing but height. The trick wasn't conquering the spire. It was using it, turning a column of rock into a wall no army could climb, and a 1,000-foot drop into the world's best front door. They didn't beat the impossible site. They hired it as their own fortification, and it never asked for wages. The first 2 perched on the rock. This one crawled under it. In southern Spain, the town of Setenil de las Bodegas is squeezed into a tight river gorge, and a colossal slab of rock leans out over the street like a wave frozen mid-break. Most builders would look at a 1,000,000-ton overhang above their heads and run. Instead, the townspeople looked up and thought, that's a roof. So they built their houses straight into the gap beneath it, walls of stone closing off the front, and for a ceiling, nothing but the living cliff. The giant overhanging rock becomes the roof of a whole row of homes at once. A single boulder doing the work of 100 separate rooftops. Around 3,000 people still live under that stone today, with streets named, literally, for the sun and the shade the rock gives them. And here's why it's genuinely clever, not just dramatic. The rock is meters thick. It holds the houses cool through the brutal Andalusian summer and warm through winter. Natural climate control, for free, that no air conditioner can match. The trick is the simplest one in the whole episode. They didn't build a roof, and they didn't fight for the space. They moved in underneath a roof the river had been carving for 1,000,000 years, and let the planet do the heavy lifting. Setenil borrowed a roof. This next place skipped building almost entirely. In northwest Iran, on the flank of Mount Sahand, sits the village of Kandovan, and from a distance it looks like a colony of giant stone beehives, hundreds of tapering cones pushing up out of the hillside. Those cones aren't built. They were erupted. When Sahand blew, thousands of years ago, it buried the valley in volcanic ash that hardened into a soft stone called tuff. And weather carved the rest into these spires. Then people did something I find quietly genius. They didn't stack anything up. They dug in. The houses of Kandovan are carved straight into the solid cones. Rooms hollowed out room by room. Doors and windows cut into the faces, some of them 2, 3, 4 stories tall inside a single rock. There's no foundation because there's no separate building. The house and the ground are one continuous piece of stone. And the tuff pays them back. It's porous and full of air, so it works like thick natural insulation, warm in winter, cool in the summer. Some of these carved homes are at least 700 years old, and this is the part 1. Love, people still live in them. The trick here is the opposite of everything else on this list. They didn't add a building to an impossible place. They subtracted the impossible place until a building was left inside it. That one was ancient. This next one isn't ancient or holy at all. It's pure stubbornness, and honestly, it's my favorite. In Serbia, in the middle of the fast-flowing Drina River, there's a single rock barely bigger than a small room, sitting almost dead center in the current. Back in 1968, a group of young swimmers wanted somewhere to lie in the sun and rest mid-river. So they built a tiny wooden house right on top of that rock, out in the middle of the water. There's no bridge, no causeway, nothing. You get there by boat, the same way they carried up every plank and nail to build it. And the river does exactly what you'd fear. It has reached up and swept the house away again and again, destroyed 7 separate times by floods and ice, right up until recent years. And every single time, they have simply built it back. Newer versions cheat a little, 2 concrete beams anchoring it down so the next flood has to work harder. But that's it. It serves no grand purpose, no devotion, no defense. It's a little wooden house on a rock in a river, held up by nothing but one stubborn stone and a refusal to let the water have the view. Sometimes the impossible sight isn't solved by engineering. It's solved by people who simply won't accept that they can't be there. Now to Portugal, for a house that barely looks designed at all. Up in the hills near Faith, in the north of the country, sits the Casa do Penedo, the House of the Rock. And the first time you see it, it reads like a cartoon, a little stone cottage that seems to have grown straight out of a cluster of giant boulders on a bare windswept slope. But it isn't between the boulders. The boulders are the house. 4 enormous rocks, each one already sitting on that hillside, were turned into the foundation, the walls, and the roof of a single home, built across just 2 years in the early 1970s. All the builders added were the in-between bits, a front wall closing the gaps, a door, a couple of small windows, a roof patch where the rocks didn't quite meet. Everything that normally costs the most to build, the heavy structure holding the weight up, was already there, delivered by geology, paid for by nobody. The trick is to stop seeing rocks as the obstacle and start seeing them as the structure. Why bother? Originally, just a quiet country escape, though so many curious visitors turned up that the owner eventually moved out, and it became a little museum. It's the purest version of the whole idea on this list. Don't build a shelter near the rock. Let the rock be the shelter, and only fill in what's missing. Back to Spain, but this time the danger isn't above the town, it's under it. Castellfollit de la Roca sits on a long, narrow finger of black basalt rock that rises more than 50 meters straight out of the ground, with two rivers meeting at its foot. And the town doesn't sit safely back from the edge. The houses are built right on it, some of them with their back walls flush with a sheer 50-meter drop hanging over the valley. From across the gorge it looks reckless, a whole village balanced on a knife of stone. So why hasn't it sheared off? The answer is in the rock itself. This cliff is basalt, cooled lava, stacked in two ancient flows. And as basalt cools, it cracks into tall vertical columns, almost like a bundle of stone pillars packed side by side. That structure is the trick. Those vertical columns make the cliff face stand up cleanly and hold its shape, instead of crumbling into a slope the way softer rock would. The town isn't balanced on loose rubble. It's perched on a natural colonnade, nature's own retaining wall, roughly a kilometer long. The builders read the geology correctly. Pick the one kind of cliff that stays a cliff, and the edge stops being a hazard and becomes the most spectacular street in Catalonia. And finally, the most modern and the most outrageous of the lot. Every site so far had at least some ground to work with: a cliff, a cone, a rock. This last one had none. When a city runs out of land entirely, a few people look up at the one surface nobody's used, the roof, and decide that's the plot. The most famous case sat on top of a high-rise in Beijing. A man hauled construction up 26 floors and built himself a sprawling private villa on the roof, and not just a penthouse. He carried up rock, soil, and plants and built an entire fake mountain landscape up there. Boulders, shrubs, a little fantasy crag, around 800 square meters of it, perched 200-odd feet above everyone else's living rooms. And here's where the architect in me winces. A roof is engineered to hold a roof's weight: people, furniture, snow. It is absolutely not engineered to hold a mountain. The neighbors felt the building groan, cracks appeared, and it was, predictably, completely illegal. No permission, too heavy, a danger to everyone below. The authorities ordered the whole rocky fantasy torn down, and after years of complaints, it was. But it captures the final frontier of the impossible site perfectly. When there's no land left at street level, the last empty plot in the entire city is the sky above everybody else's heads. 8 impossible addresses: a cliff, a rock spire, the underside of a boulder, a stone in a river, a carved volcanic cone, a house made of 4 rocks, the edge of a basalt cliff, and a rooftop. And not one of them is held up by magic. The cliff temple hangs on beams. The monasteries use height as a wall. Setenil borrows a rock for a roof. Kandovan carves its home out of solid stone. The Dina house clings to one stubborn rock. Casa do Pinedo is its boulders. Castellfollit trusts the way basalt cracks. The rooftop villa stole the only land left, and paid for it. Every single one answers the same question I asked at the start: where does the weight go? Each found a different honest answer, and each was built for a human reason: to be safe, to be holy, to keep a view, or simply to prove it could be done. So here's the thought I'll leave you with. Impossible sites aren't really about the engineering at all. The engineering is almost always simpler than it looks from below: one beam, one rock, one overhang, one honest path for the weight. What's actually rare is the wanting. Every building here exists because somebody wanted to be in exactly that spot, so badly that they were willing to outsmart the ground to get there, and then read their impossible site closely enough to find its one trick. If you find that as worth staring at as I do, the channel is full of these. Stick around, and I'll keep pulling them apart for you.